In this galaxy, wars do not always start with a declaration. Sometimes they start with a contract. One signature, one corporate seal, and an entire system is told to comply or bleed. Above Havenfall, a training academy is running drills when the lights blink and the sky fills with ships that are not here to negotiate. Commander Evan Mercer hears the demand, and he understands it instantly. This is not protection. It is a leash. Lieutenant Kara Vance saw a flicker slice across her display, and her stomach went cold. For a heartbeat, it looked like space had been cut open, then stitched closed. Astor Gate Orbital Academy floated above Havenfall Colony like a silver ring pinned to the dark. It was not a city, and it was not meant to be kind. Earth built it to train the people who kept ships alive. Cadets here were 18 to 20, and most of them still believed discipline could outrun panic. That belief was the point because in real emergencies, panic spent oxygen first. One mistake could turn a rescue into a tomb. Not far from the academy, the patrol ship Vigilant held a defensive line with engines warm and weapons cold. Commander Evan Mercer kept the distance precise, because precision was how you kept a quiet system quiet. Kara pulled the sensor frame back and replayed it. The flicker returned as a thin ripple, a refusal of space to stay flat. Then it vanished again. She widened the band and tightened the gain. It did not behave like debris, and it did not behave like any scheduled jump emergence. Mercer leaned over her station without wasting a second. His voice stayed flat, like he was pricing risk. Mercer said, "Repeat that reading. Give me the raw trace." Kara said, "No transponder, no drift profile. It looks like a fold, an unscheduled jump emergence." Mercer did not argue with the words, and he did not let the bridge drift into hope. He keyed the command channel and turned his tone into a shield. Mercer said, "Helm, defensive arc between the academy and open space. Weapons to standby. No targeting without my word." Captain Jonas Reed confirmed and pushed the Vigilant into position. The deck thrummed as thrusters adjusted, and the shield grid warmed from idle to ready. Kara widened the scan again, and the anomaly grew sharper instead of fading. It stretched into a line, then swelled into a bloom that made her teeth feel tight inside her jaw. She swallowed and kept her voice usable. Her hands stayed steady because the bridge needed them steady. Kara said, "It is opening, Commander. It is getting bigger." Mercer stared at the blooming distortion as if staring could change the math. He looked like a man who had promised someone this system would stay quiet. On Astorgate, the morning was still pretending to be routine. Cadets ran a rescue circuit under artificial weight, dragging inert training pods and clipping magnetic tethers to rail points with hands that made every motion clumsy. Cadet Lila Mercer, trainee rescue commander, drove her boots into the track and kept her breathing even. The station still smelled like sterilized metal and recycled air, and she had learned to treat that smell like purpose. Her teammate, Cadet Owen Vance, checked his tether line twice before he moved. Cadet Mina Park called timing cues under her breath and never looked tired, which made everyone else run harder. Chief Instructor Halden Sato walked the line above them with a tablet and a stare. He had the voice of someone who had seen hulls fail in real time. Sato said, "Keep the line. If you panic, you waste oxygen." Lila pushed harder and kept her visor steady. She wanted the work to matter before it ever became blood. Then the station lights blinked once. It was small enough to feel impolite, but the deck shivered under their boots like a deep cough running through the structure. Tethers snapped tight as bodies corrected by instinct. Sato's hand went to his belt, and his eyes cut across the line, counting steadiness the way a pilot counted fuel. Sato said, "All cadets hold. Helmets sealed." Visors dropped, and seals hissed, and training turned into procedure. The corridor air tasted sharper as filtration systems shifted modes. A speaker played a tone that did not belong to drills. Then the station voice followed, steady and clear, and it said, "Attention, transition to station readiness. All cadet units report to muster points." This is not a drill. Lila ran with her section through corridors that were suddenly closing around them. doors sealed in sequence, and each seal made the station feel smaller. Along the way, she caught glimpses of other cadets moving in disciplined streams through viewports. They were not running for themselves, and they were running as a unit. They reached a hardened bay built for hull breaches and fires. Cadets lined up and clipped into harness points without being told, because training was the only thing that still felt reliable. Sato counted heads with his eyes and did not need a roster. He counted like someone counting survivors without looking at a number. On the Vigilant, Kara zoomed the field out, and her screen filled with new contacts. Empty space ahead stopped being empty. Ships arrived as if poured into the dark, dozens, then hundreds, arranged into a patient blockade. Their formation cut across every civilian route out of Havenfall like a hand closing over a throat. Kara felt cold settle in her stomach as her system matched the signature. She forced her voice to stay steady because the bridge needed it. Kara said, "Kovar Security Combine, confirmed by hull geometry and emission mass pattern." Mercer stared at the growing ring of enemy icons and saw his reflection in the glass. His eyes looked hollowed by duty, and he hated what that meant. Mercer said, "Open a channel to Astergate. Move cadets into hardened compartments now." Reed pointed at the traffic map, and his finger hovered over civilian lanes being squeezed shut. The blockade was doing its work without ever speaking. Reed said, "They are overriding beacons. Civilian ships are being forced to reroute, and 2 supply convoys are trapped between their lanes." Mercer said, "Warn Havenfall Colony. Shelter orders and blackout now." Reed sent it, and Kara watched the outbound packet go. She wondered how many people would believe it in time, and how many would need proof before they moved. A tight signal pushed into their comm stack and took priority. Kara's console flagged it as a forced, system-wide broadcast. Kara said, "Incoming message. It is broadcast across every band they can reach." Mercer nodded once, and he did not blink. He looked like a man who already knew the terms of the threat. Mercer said, "Put on." The main screen filled with a corporate seal and a legal header. Under it was a single demand short enough to memorize. It demanded immediate compliance and registration of all orbital assets under Kovar protection. It required disabling local weapons for inspection and submission of governing authority to provisional oversight. At the bottom sat a name that carried more weight than a fleet. Director General Kashin Vorak, Supreme Commander of Kovar Security Combine. Kara exhaled, then swallowed. Her mouth formed the honest word before she could stop it. Kara said, "A contract." Mercer said, "A leash. Record everything, start a hardened mirror, and if we lose the ship, I want the logs to survive us." Kara began the copy without being told twice. She duplicated the files, then duplicated them again, as if repetition could keep the dead from vanishing. A civilian transport tried to hold course toward Havenfall. The pilot argued in an open band that he had medical supplies and clearance. Mercer started to answer, but Kovar answered first. A heavy platform pivoted and fired into empty space beside the convoy. The flash washed over the transport's sensors, and the pilot flinched, rolling away from the lane. The message was clean: "Obey the reroute or you become an accident." Kara said, "Warning shot." Mercer watched the convoy scatter behind the planet's curve. Heat rose in his chest, and he kept his tone even because rage made people sloppy. Mercer said, "Broadcast shelter orders again. Push it through every civilian band." Kara's display overlaid targeting lines as the blockade tightened. The lines were not aimed at the Vigilant. They were aimed at Astergate. Kara said, "Commander, targeting locks are warming on the Academy." Mercer did not look away from the overlay. He spoke like a man choosing the only geometry he could live with. Mercer said, "Full burn, put us between them and the station." The Vigilant surged forward and range numbers fell. The enemy platforms did not shift because they had planned for this. Kara tried to open a direct link to Kovar Command. A wall of interference hit her hard and deliberate, layered like a practiced hand. Kara said, "They are jamming us hard, layered, and tuned to our sensors." Then a live feed forced its way through anyway, because Kovar did not need silence. The screen filled with a man in a dark uniform, sitting in a chair that looked like a boardroom seat, not a bridge station. His posture was perfect, and his eyes were calm. Director General Kashin Vorik looked like a man closing a deal. Vorik said, "Earth vessel vigilant, withdraw behind the colony limb and await processing." Mercer said, "This system is under United Earth. Council jurisdiction. You have no authority here." Vorik said, "Authority is purchased. Your system is overdue." Mercer did not ask overdue to whom, because he knew the business. Kovar arrived with an invoice and a fleet, then waited for fear to do the rest. Mercer said, "We will not sign your contract." Vorik said, "Then you will learn what non-compliance costs." Mercer keyed a secure channel toward Earth Relay, and the jamming made every syllable expensive. Static fought him like a hand on his throat. Mercer said, "Chairman Roland Pierce, this is Commander Mercer in Havenfall. We have a Kovar blockade and an immediate threat to Astergate." Static snapped, then a voice answered brief and sharp. It carried the sound of waking rooms and moving hands. Pierce said, "Understood. Do what you must. We are waking every desk that matters." The line died, and Mercer stared at the dead channel. He forced his hands to keep working, because grief could not fly a ship. On Astergate, Chief Instructor Sato herded cadets deeper in a hardened base. The station voice repeated instructions as doors sealed, and each seal sounded like a promise and a threat. Lila clipped her harness and tried to keep her hands from shaking. Owen Vance was strapped 2 positions down, eyes locked on the hatch like he could hold it shut by will. Mina Park mouthed the count under her breath. She timed the tremors like heartbeats because timing made fear smaller. The academy shuddered again, and it had direction now. It felt like pressure building outside the hull, patient and cruel. The station voice returned, tight and automatic. It reported external targeting and ordered everyone to brace. Sato kept his voice simple because panic ate oxygen. He did not raise it, and he did not soften it. Sato said, "Down, chin tucked, hands on harness." They dropped as one, and the bay filled with sealed breath and fabric strain. The only sound was the truth of 100 people trying to stay quiet. On the Vigilant, Kara's console flared red. Her words came out fast, because the numbers were moving faster. Kara said, "Weapons discharge. Multiple beams, they are firing on the academy." Mercer did not pray and did not speak to any camera. He moved. Mercer said, "All power to shields. Counterfire on their firing platforms. Reed, keep us on that line." The Vigilance. Shield halo brightened as the ship accelerated. Light crossed the gap and struck Astergate, and the station shield flared, rippling like heat over metal. A second volley hit the same quadrant. The flare turned white, and the ripple turned jagged. Kara said, "Shield integrity is dropping fast. Overload in the northern arc." Mercer keyed the academy channel and kept his voice level. Panic would not add oxygen, and it would not add seconds. Mercer said, "Astergate, initiate evacuation pods." "Repeat, evacuation pods, move cadets now." On the station, the evacuation sequence tried to start. Lila felt it in the deck vibration, the rumble of launch racks unlocking somewhere beyond the bay. She waited for the relief of motion, then the rumble died. The bay went wrong in a new way. The station voice stuttered like it could not decide which emergency mattered most. It reported launch bay doors compromised, and it reported the sequence interrupted. Sato looked at the cadets and did not lie. He gave them the only plan that was still real. Sato said, "We stay sealed. We keep air, and we wait for the escort to make a hole." Mercer heard none of that from where he stood. He watched the tactical overlay and felt timing slip through his fingers, because Kovar had arranged the bore before they ever spoke. The station shield failed with a sudden quiet on the screen, like a candle going out. The next impacts did not look like explosions at this distance. They looked like structure losing agreement. A section of the ring separated, drifted a fraction too far, then fractured into smaller pieces as pressure and momentum took over. Inside the hardened bay, Lila felt the floor tilt. Her harness bit into her shoulders as lights flickered and the station voice overlapped itself with alarms. The station voice repeated a warning about pressure loss in Sector 7. It repeated it again, as if repetition could make it less true. Sato slammed a manual lever and forced a seal. The hatch locked with a heavy clack that sounded like a door closing on the old day. A cadet near Lila whispered in a small voice that did not belong in a war. The cadet said, "Are we going to die?" Lila forced her voice to work because someone had to keep the room human. She turned towards Sato, and her throat felt too tight to be normal. Lila said, "Chief, what do we do?" Sato did not raise his voice, and that steadiness was the only thing that held. He spoke like a man who had survived enough to understand the math. Sato said, "We do what we trained. We conserve air, we stay together, and we do not waste motion." The base shook hard enough to rattle teeth. Somewhere outside, metal groaned in a sound like tearing that did not belong in any drill. On the Vigilant, Kara watched life sign clusters wink out across her map. Not all at once, but in uneven drops like lights going dark in a city. The casualty counter climbed in the corner of her display. She did not say the number out loud, because saying it would make it real in a new way. Mercer stared at one cluster labeled with a trainee roster tag. Cadet Lila Mercer. The label blinked, held for a heartbeat, then vanished. Mercer swallowed once and did not let anyone hear it. Mercer said, "Pull back behind the colony limb. Keep the Vigilant alive and get the recordings safe." Reed stared at him like he had misheard. His hands hovered over controls that wanted to do the impossible. Reed said, "Sir, we are leaving them?" Mercer said, "We are leaving nothing but a witness. If we die here, the only story that survives is theirs." Vorik's feed returned without being requested. His face filled the screen again, calm as a man closing a deal. Vorik said, "Let this be your receipt. You have 1 day to sign compliance, and if you delay, I will collect again." Mercer leaned toward the microphone, and his words did not shake. He did not give Vorik the satisfaction of crack. Mercer said, "You targeted a training station." Vorik said, "I targeted your future. You will understand that language." The feed cut, and the Havenfall horizon below stayed dark. A pale glow rose where the station had been, and debris caught sunlight and scattered it like dust. Mercer turned away from a window and gave the next orders without raising his voice. He made sure every word was a door the enemy could not walk through. Mercer said, "Close the system gate relays. Pull civilian comms into secure channels. No public broadcasts, and no replies to Kovar, not one word." Kutta wiped her face and kept copying sensor logs to harden storage. Her hand stayed steady through grief, because work was the only thing that did not collapse. Mercer watched the empty space where Astergate had floated. He forced his mind onto the only truth that mattered. Kovar wanted fear and a panic signature. Earth would give them silence, and behind that silence, Earth would move. 2 hours after Astergate went dark, the names began to arrive. They came as quiet notifications on private screens, then formed a public list that would not end. Faces, academy numbers, hometowns, and last check-in times rolled forward without mercy. Havenfall Colony kept its lights low, and the Vigilant held station behind the planet limb with engines warm and weapons cold. Commander Evan Mercer stood on the bridge and watched the casualty board refresh. He did not read every line because he could not. Lieutenant Kara Vance read it anyway because her hands needed work. She did not stop on the name she knew until her eyes burned. Captain Jonas Reed leaned in, and his voice was quieter than usual. The ship sounded like it was holding its breath. Reed said, "Earth Relay is back on a narrow beam. Chairman Roland Pierce wants your report." Mercer nodded once and did not add emotion to it. He had learned the enemy was listening for that. Mercer said, "Send the logs, every sensor frame, every jam signature. No commentori." Kara pushed the package out through the tight channel. The data went first, and grief could wait. Down on Terra Prime, dawn hit the United Earth Council Plaza like a clean blade of light. A crowd gathered without orders, and they did not chant. They did not shout, and they did not break the line. They stood shoulder to shoulder and looked up at a single screen. The screen showed faces, and a voice read names in a steady cadence that did not break and did not hurry. The sound turned a list into a wound everyone shared. When the voice reached Cadet Owen Vance, Kara turned her head away from her own display. She pressed her knuckles to her lips until her breathing steadied. When the last name on the first page finished, the screen did not fade. It advanced, and the crowd stayed where it was. Inside the council chambers, Chairman Pierce stood, with hands flat on the table. Counselor Miriam Ross sat across from him with eyes dry. Around them, aides passed tablets and kept their voices low. The room was quiet in a way that felt like a decision. A recruitment director entered without ceremony, her face tight with numbers. She spoke like someone reporting weather, because shock had already burned off. The director said, "Centers are full. People are lining up outside." Pierce did not look surprised, and that was the worst part. He looked like a man who had known this day would come, just not its date. Pierce said, "Authorize expanded intake." A supply minister followed, already moving. His hands shook as he held his slate, and he hated that it was visible. The minister said, "Factories want the switch orders." Ross said, "Give them. Agriculture lines first, then heavy machining." On another wall, a logistics map lit up as convoys rerouted. Medical stock moved towards shipyards, and fuel allocations shifted as the system adjusted without debate. Pierce tapped a control and muted the room. He said the rule out loud, so nobody could misunderstand it later. Pierce said, "No broadcast to Kovar." No responses, not one. Ross met his eyes, and she did not ask softly. She asked like a woman who knew words could start wars. Ross said, "And our answer?" Pierce looked at the Havenfall feed and the empty orbit where the academy had been. He did not speak like a politician, and he did not perform. Pierce said, "The one who signed that strike pays." That is all we say today. 3 nights later, Earth opened a door the galaxy did not know existed. It lay beyond the edge of mapped lanes, hidden behind old scaffolds and deeper rules. A hull of dark composite slid out of a cradle. It moved in silence with navigation lamps kept low, like a ship leaving home without waking anyone. Admiral Celine Hart watched from control mezzanine. She was Earth Defense Command's architect for contingencies no one wanted. Her hair was pulled tight and her voice was calm. It carried the sound of decisions made before anyone else was ready. Hart said, "Black Harbor program is active. Launch sequence is green. Below, the flagship Valiant Dawn eased forward. Its surface drank starlight, angles cut for heat control and low signature. Smaller warships followed, each one built for endurance, not parades." Their crews did not cheer, because this was not a celebration. A junior officer handed Hart's slate. Hart glanced once, then walked like the numbers were already part of her spine. Commander Mercer appeared on a secure screen from Vigilant. He looked older than he had a week ago, and duty had carved the change deep. Mercer said, "Havenfall is sealed. Kovar holds the outer lanes, and they're scanning everything." Hart did not ask for opinions, and she did not offer comfort. Her job was movement. Hart said, "You will not break their blockade head-on. You will make them chase shadows." She tapped the slate and unfolded a map into a path. The route looked like it had been drawn by a knife, not a pen. Hart said, "Targets." Their eyes, their ears, their hands. Mercer tracked the points and felt the shape of the war shift. Listening relays, transfer nodes, contract servers. Mercer said, "You want proof?" Hart said, "I want control. Proof follows if we are careful." A second screen lit with Counselor Ross. Her face was steady, and her words were a hard boundary. Ross said, "We keep the moral line. No civilian lanes and no reprisals." Hart did not argue. She simply accepted the constraint because discipline was a weapon too. Hart said, "Understood. We strike their machinery, not their cities." Hart turned to her launch crew and kept her commands clean. She removed every excuse for hero moves. Hart said scout flights first. No mistakes and no hero moves. On the Valiant Dawn, boarding pods called Hammerfall locked into racks. Sergeant Elena Reyes checked her squad in silence. She wore no medals on her chest plate, just a plain name tab. The squad moved with the quiet rhythm of people who had practiced grief into discipline. A private asked too softly to be brave. His voice cracked on the last word. The private said, "Sergeant, what is the plan?" Reyes looked at him like she was looking through him to the work. She did not feed fear, and she did not feed hope. Reyes said, "We do our jobs. We take what matters, and we come back." On the 7th day after the strike, Kovar moved again. They did not send another contract, and they sent a team. Dr. Nathan Hale left the council complex after midnight. 2. Security officers escorted him, and the driver never spoke. Hale carried a sealed case that was light enough to hold in one hand and heavy enough to change a war. Inside were sensor logs from the Vigilant and Academy backups, and a signature match that tied the order to a name. The van took a service ramp into an underground lane. The city above stayed quiet, and the van lights dimmed to red as it entered a tunnel. The first sign was the dead zone, and it arrived like a switch flipped. The driver frowned as his console went blank. The driver said, "Signal loss." All bands dropped. The tunnel cameras blinked out one by one. The van brakes chirped as the road ahead filled with smoke that should not have been there. One guard raised her weapon, and Hale did not see faces. He saw movement and practiced coordination. A device clamped to the van roof with a heavy thud. Metal screamed, and the vehicle lurched. The second guard shoved Hale down between seats. Her voice did not shake, and that steadiness was its own training. The guard said, "Stay low." Hale hugged the case like it was a pulse. Outside, boots struck concrete in a pattern that was not human security. A door tool bit into the side hatch, and the lock failed. A figure reached in and grabbed for the case, and Hale saw a gloved hand and a flash of white light. It was not an explosion, and it was worse in a different way. It was a flood, like someone turned on a small sun. A counter team hit from the rear service door. 2 bodies dropped, and Hale heard weapons fire that was short and controlled, then silence again. The second guard hauled him up by his collar. Her eyes were hard, and the tunnel made every breath loud. The guard said, "Move." They ran through a maintenance passage that smelled like coolant. Behind them, a Kovar operative tried to regroup. A drone buzzed overhead, then died as a jammer pulse snapped through the corridor. The air turned sharp with burn electronics. At the tunnel exit, a black vehicle waited with no plates and no logos. A woman in a plain coat opened the door, and Hale recognized her before she spoke. Ross said, "Dr. Hale, give me the case." Hale handed it over, with shaking fingers. Ross nodded once, and her calm did not soften the night. Ross said, "They wanted this to frighten us. It will do the opposite." By the time Kovar realized the grab had failed, Earth was already inside their rhythm. A Black Harbor scout ship drifted near a Kovar transfer station in the outer Havenfall lanes. The station was a steel hub that moved fuel, spare parts, and contract enforcement teams. It was also a choke point, and it lived on habit. Commander Mercer watched from the Vigilant at a safe distance, hidden in the shadow of the colony ring. His ship stayed quiet while the scout did the work. Lieutenant Kara Vance spoke without looking up from her bands. She sounded tired, and she sounded precise. Kara said, "They're cycling port traffic every 6 minutes. They think nobody can see it through their jam." Mercer said, "Show me a gap." Kara traced one with her finger. Her nail tapped the screen once like punctuation. Kara said there, "When their inspection craft rotates, we get 12 seconds of blind overlap." On the Valiant Dawn, Admiral Hart listened and made a decision in one breath. She did not ask for permission from time. Hart said, "Hammerfall teams go on my mark." Reyes and her squad sat in the pod with straps tight and visors down. Nobody spoke because they did not need a speech. The pod launched and burned hard, then coasted cold. It hit the station hull where cameras did not reach, and a cutter opened a clean circle. Reyes went in first, and her body language was pure work. Inside, corridors were narrow and bright, and workers froze at the sight of armored strangers. Reyes pushed past them and pointed down. She did not waste syllables on threats. Reyes said, "Down," hands visible. Her team reached a control room with a single clerk and a biometric lock. The clerk tried to run, and a stun pulse dropped him without blood. Reyes stepped over him and placed a capture tap on the console. Data spilled into the tap, fast and ugly. Chain of command, contract approvals, payment routes, and field orders that rolled up to one office. Chief Auditor Silas Venn, then Director General Cashin Vorik. Reyes did not read every line. She tagged the whole set and pulled the tap free. The station alarm finally found its voice. Kovar security teams converged, and Reyes waved her squad back toward the breach point. They exited as cleanly as they entered. The pod detached and vanished in the dark before Kovar guns could track it. On the Vigilant, Kara watched the transfer complete and felt something shift in her chest. It was not relief, and it was direction. Mercer opened a secure link to Admiral Hart. His words were short, because short was safer. Mercer said, "We have the trail." Hart's eyes did not soften. She nodded like a blade, agreeing to a path. Hart said, "Good. Now we lock the mission." She paused, then spoke the rule that would shape everything after. Her voice stayed level, because level voices last longer. Hart said, "We go in. We take Vorik alive, we take his paperwork, and we take his voice." Mercer looked at the Haven Falls sky and the empty place where Astor Gate had been. His throat tightened, and he did not let it show. Mercer said, "Understood." No words to them, only movement. The jump did not feel wrong at first. The Valiant Dawn and its screen of escorts came out cold and tight inside a quiet pocket of space. Stars looked normal, and lanes looked clear. For 3 seconds, Lieutenant Kara Vance believed Kovar had made a mistake. Then the quiet turned sharp. Her display filled with noise that had shape, not static. It was layered in bands and tuned for human sensors. It was a net. Kara said, "Decoys." They planted false beacons. Commander Evan Mercer watched the tactical map distort. Icons flickered and multiplied, and friendly targeting aids began to disagree with each other. Admiral Celine Hart spoke on the flagship channel, and her comm became the only stable point. She kept the fleet from firing into ghosts. Hart said, "All ships hold fire. Confirm targets by 2 systems." The order came late for one reason, and Kara saw it as the net tightened. Kovar had already fired. A line of light crossed the gap from an unseen platform. It hit an escort on the edge of formation, and the ship lurched, lost attitude control, then spun away, trailing fragments that flashed in sunlight. Captain Jonas Reed gripped his console on the Vigilant. His jaw tightened like he was biting down on the truth. Reed said, "We are in a kill box." Karabi didn't it. The field and saw it. The enemy did not sit at the center. They sat around the edges, hidden behind emission masks, waiting for the jump bloom. Commodore Tariq Keth wanted one clean lesson. Mercer felt it in the timing of the strikes and in the patience. Mercer said, "Reed, pull us left. Keep our bow toward their fire lanes." Reed moved the Vigilant, thrusters biting hard. A second strike hit a different escort. Shields flared then fell, and the ship went dark and drifted. Kara counted losses as they happened, because counting kept her breathing steady. She did not decorate the report, because decoration wasted time. Kara said, 3 ships disabled. 1 ship lost, more hits incoming. Hart did not raise her voice. She did not need volume to make a fleet obey. Hart said, "Break formation. Pairs and trios move like smoke." Earth ships scattered in practice patterns. They did not flee in straight lines. They stepped sideways through space, always changing vector, always forcing Kovar to recalculate. Kovar adjusted anyway, because discipline fought discipline. Their fire was tight, and their timing precise, because a trap like this was not anger, it was planning. On the Valiant Dawn, damage reports stacked up. No one described bodies, and no one needed to. An officer said, 2 ships lost. 5 injured crews. Another said, 1 boarding team pod ruptured. The silence between reports carried enough weight. Kara kept her eyes on the spectrum, because that was the job. Kara found the core of the net and marked it. Her finger hovered on the screen like she was touching a bruise. Kara said, "Their jamming anchor is off our port. If we cut it, we see." Mercer watched the solution form in her voice. He did not flatter it, because flattery wasted time. Mercer said, "Can you cut it?" Kara said, "Not at this range. We need a closer blade." Hart answered before Mercer could ask. She did not hesitate, and her trust was not emotional. Hart said, "Hammerfall teams, you have one window." Sergeant Elena Reyes was already strapped into a pod. Her squad checked each other in a tight rhythm, hands on locks, eyes on the green light. No speeches and no prayers, just work. The pod launched small and fast, then went cold mid-flight. It coasted into the edge of the jamming field where Kovar sensors looked away. On purpose, Reyes hit the anchor platform like a thrown tool, then her team cut in. They moved through a narrow service corridor and reached a control cabinet pulsing with power. Reyes planted a charge designed to break hardware, not vaporize rooms. It popped the cabinet and killed the anchor in one dull thump. Kara's screen cleared like fog lifting. Kara said there, "Real targets marked." The relief lasted seconds, and Kara knew why. Kovar had more anchors, and now they knew Earth could cut them. A new volley came in heavier and tighter. The Valiant Dawn took a glancing hit that shook its frame, and the flagship shield held. The message was clear anyway. Kovar could trade metal for time, and they had planned for that. Mercer watched another escort go silent. He did not let it turn into rage, because rage was the enemy's favorite gift. Mercer said, "Admiral, this is not the center, it is a lure." Hart stared at the map and nodded. She did not pretend she had not wanted to push. Hart said, "Agreed." Mercer said, "Then we leave now." Hart paused for one beat, then chose. The choice sounded like survival wearing a uniform. Hart said, "All ships, execute corridor route gray. We do not bleed here." Earth ships shifted as one and found a side lane mapped for emergencies. It was narrow and awkward, but it broke the geometry of the kill box. Kovar fire followed them, but angles worsened and the trap lost its teeth. When the last Earth ship slipped into the corridor, Kara exhaled and read the final count. Kara said, 7 ships disabled, 3 ships lost, and hundreds injured across the fleet. Mercer closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them. His voice came back clean because he forced it clean. Mercer said, "Keep moving. We did not come to die in their rehearsal." Kovar did not chase blindly. They guided Earth toward a second choice, a worse one. A civilian freight cluster sat ahead on the corridor exit. It was a ring of fuel tenders and food barges, the kind Havenfall needed to keep breathing. Kovar's ships appeared near it, not inside it. They were close enough to forced out without ever admitting intent. A transmission pushed through on an open band with a corporate seal and a legal tone. It announced protective inspection of civilian assets and warned that interference would be treated as unlawful aggression. Mercer heard it and did not answer. Kara watched the geometry and felt the trap tighten around their ethics. Kara said, "They want us to fire through the freighters." Reed leaned closer, and the tightness in his voice sounded like restraint under pressure. Reed said, "If we hesitate, they will pin us again." Hart's voice came across the channel, and it cut through temptation like a hard line on a map. Hart said, "We do not fire into civilian lanes." A junior captain cut in, strained but controlled. He sounded like a man watching his crew count seconds. The captain said, "Admiral, we will lose momentum." Hart said, "We will keep our soul. Find another line." Civilian captains began broadcasting pleas that sounded like fear trying to become policy. Their voices filled the band like static with names. One said, "Please do not shoot near us. We are unarmed, right?" Another said, "We are carrying medical." Mercer felt his hands clench, then relax. He stared at the freighter ring and chose the only answer he could live with. Mercer said, "Reed, put us between Kovar and the barges. Shields forward." Reed did it, and the Vigilant slid into place. It took a long-range strike that made the shield flare bright, but it held. The message to civilians was simple without words. Earth was not going to use them as cover. Earth was going to be the cover. Kara fed targeting updates to the fleet. She did not paint targets inside the freighter ring. She painted the platforms that controlled the ring. Hart chose a slower route, and she owned the cost. The fleet pulled wide and burned along the edge of the system plane, accepting the price in time. Kovar fire clipped them twice during the turn. One escort lost thrust and had to be towed. Kara spoke casualty updates with a flat voice. It was the only way to keep them usable. Kara said, "One more ship disabled. 20 more injured." Mercer heard each number and stored it, not as rage, but as accounting. He was learning Kovar's language, and he hated that it was necessary. As the fleet cleared the civilian cluster, Kovar stopped pressing. They got what they wanted, time, and they assumed time would grow fear. And in time, fear grew in most species. Kovar assumed Earth would break the same way. On the Iron Crown, Commodore Keth watched the feeds and smiled without warmth. His smile belonged to a man who believed he had found a weakness. Keth said, "They refuse the obvious shot. Their morality is a chain." Chief of Operations Drax Marrow nodded. His eyes tracked numbers, not lives. Marrow said, "We tighten it. Then they sign." Earth learned too, but not what Kovar expected. They learned they could not win by charging at a map. They would win by taking the map away. They would win by taking the signatures away. On the Valiant Dawn, Hart gathered Mercer, Kara, and Dr. Nathan Hale on a tight channel. No grand conference, just screens and short voices. Hale spoke first, because he was the one who understood how machines confessed. His tone was plain, like lab work. Hale said, "Kovar is not an empire. It is a machine, and machines leave records." Kara pulled up the stolen data and kept her hand steady. Her steadiness was a kind of anger that had learned discipline. Kara said, "We already have a trail, but we need the signature that ties orders to one hand." Hart nodded once. Her eyes did not soften, but her voice carried a clean purpose. Hart said, "Then we take a hand that holds ink." A small strike team launched in the shadow of a debris field. They aimed for a ledger ship, a moving office that carried contract proofs and command authorizations. Kara guided them in using jamming patterns she had mapped. She spoke like a pilot speaking someone through a storm. Kara said, "Stay inside their blind wedge. Do not light your engines." The strike ship coasted up to the ledger hull and latched on. Reyes led the boarding again through quiet corridors where the air smelled like sterilizer and printer toner. A Kovar clerk stepped into a hallway, saw armored figures, and froze. Reyes raised a hand and made the room smaller with 2 words. Reyes said, "Down. Hands where I can see them." The clerk complied, because compliance was what he had been trained to sell. Another tried to run, and a stun pulse dropped him without blood. They reached a secure room with a biometric lock and a data port sealed behind corporate plates. A clerk inside tried to speak, voice stiff with policy. The clerk said, "This is property of Kovar Security Combined. Unauthorized access will result in legal action." Reyes did not argue. She placed a capture tap on the panel and nodded to her tech. The tap bit in and began to drink. Kara watched the stream from afar, approval chains, routing codes, and a repeating identity token. Chief Auditor Silas Van appeared everywhere. Under him were layers of managers countersigning each other to spread blame. Then at the top, the same token appeared again and again. Director General Cashin Vorik. Kara said there, "That is the biometric seal. That is his authority key." Hart did not celebrate. She did not allow victory to become a lull. Hart said, "Copy everything. Triple mirror." Hale leaned in, and his eyes looked older than his face. He spoke plain, because plain was harder to dodge. Hale said, "He will deny, but this chain does not care what he says." Reyes finished the pull and yanked the tap free. The room alarm began to wail as Kovar security teams moved. Reyes said, "Time. We are out." They left in a clean line, dragging one conscious clerk who had access codes in his head. They did not harm him, because they needed him alive. A Kovar team reached the breach point as Reyes sealed it. Shots hit the door, and the door held long enough. The strike ship detached and burned into darkness. When the team returned, Hart met them on a screen and kept praise to one line. Hart said, "Good work. Now we stop guessing." Mercer looked at the token trail and saw it as a straight road. Vorik had signed the strike, and he had built a system where that signature bought silence. Earth would not give him that silence. Not anymore. Kovar still had one advantage. Their fleet moved as a single body, linked by tight timing signals and corporate command code. That unity made their traps sharp and their reactions fast. Hart decided to break the unity long enough to slip a blade in. Kara studied the patterns and found a flaw. Her voice carried the satisfaction of clean math and the fear of the clock. Kara said, "They sync through 3 anchor nodes. They rotate keys every few minutes. If we hit the swap, they stutter." Hart did not ask if it was risky. She only asked the question that mattered. Hart said, "When?" Kara said, "At the next rotation. We get less than 1 minute." Hart looked at Mercer. She did not dress the ask in hero language. Hart said, "Can you hold the line for 1 minute?" Mercer answered without drama. His voice sounded like the man he had been trained to be. Mercer said, "Yes." The fleet approached a guarded boundary with platforms and patrol arcs. Kovar ships tightened formation, ready to punish any push. A short broadcast warned that approach towards Citadel Prime Station would be treated as hostile trespass. Mercer ignored the words and watched the rotation clock Kara had marked. Kara said, "Ready." Hart spoke once, and the fleet moved on that single point. Hart said, "Do it." Kara launched a burst of crafted noise tuned to the anchor swap. It was timing and math and a deep understanding of how Kovar kept its fleet obedient. The anchors blinked, and for a heartbeat, Kovar ships hesitated. Their formation did not collapse, but lost its perfect step. Commands arrived out of order, and target locks lagged. The window opened, and Hart did not waste it. Hart said, "Push." Earth ships surged through the seam, not into the center of the enemy, but past it. They drove toward lanes that led behind a shield wall. Kovar recovered fast, but the moment was enough. Earth gained position they were never supposed to reach. On the Iron Crown, Commodore Keth stared at the tactical feed. His voice dropped into something close to respect, and he hated it. Keth said, "They did not answer our messages. They did not bargain, and they did not rage." Marrow swallowed, and the sound was small. Marrow said, "They are learning." Keth said, "No, they are adapting." Hart watched the new geometry settle. She saw the route to the spaces where legal seals and command keys lived. She keyed the fleet channel, and her voice turned every ship into one intent. Even injured stations kept hands moving. Hart said, "Listen carefully. We are done chasing their mirrors." The bridge crews fell silent. The silence was not fear, it was alignment. Hart said, "We take the one who signed the strike. We take him alive." Mercer heard the words and felt the fleet tilt forward behind them. It was not noise, it was decision. Kara looked at her display and saw the path forward. Thin and dangerous. She did not ask if they could do it because asking was wasted time. Kara said, "When do we jump?" Hart answered with one word that made the galaxy smaller. Hart said now. Space did not forgive hesitation, and neither did Kovar. Earth's fleet arrived near Kovar's inner lanes and did not waste the window Kara had opened. The Valiant Dawn held a tight course while smaller ships peeled away like knives. They headed for the network that carried Kovar's voice. Kara watched the spectrum map settle. The loudest signals were not weapons. They were broadcasts, legal headers, and clean corporate music framing every raid as protection. Kara said, "That is their story machine." Mercer kept his eyes on the route line. His voice carried the cold clarity of a man who had watched a station die. Mercer said, "Turn it off." A Black Harbor scout slipped close to a relay mast and latched on in the dark. A cutter opened a maintenance hatch, and a team slid inside with no wasted motion. Minutes later, the relay went quiet. A dozen secondary channels died with it, and Kovar feeds stuttered across the system. On the Iron Crown, Commodore Keth felt it like a hand on his throat. He stared at his comm officer like the officer had betrayed him. Keth said, "Restore the feeds." The officer said, "We are trying. Earth is cutting distribution nodes." Keth looked at Marrow, and his jaw tightened. He spoke the truth Kovar never said out loud. Keth said, "If they control the story, they control the market." Marrow's jaw clenched. The answer came out like a threat wearing a plan. Marrow said, "Then we change the story." A legal broadcast punched through on an emergency band civilians could not ignore. It carried Kovar's seal and a cold promise. It declared Earth fleets hostile raiders. It ordered stations to deny service, and it authorized Allied forces to seize Earth vessels and detain crews. Kara heard it and did not blink. Her mouth tightened, but her voice stayed usable. Kara said, "They are painting us as criminals." Hart answered on the flagship channel. She did not waste breath defending herself to a machine. Hart said, "Let them talk. We move." Mercer did not respond to Kovar's words. He shifted formation and drove toward the target that mattered more than speeches. Citadel Prime Station was a fortress office built around servers, contract vaults, and command seats. Kovar wars began there, not on battlefields. Reed leaned toward Mercer, and his voice carried the weight of what was coming. Reed said, "They will throw everything at us now." Mercer nodded once, and the nod was not fear. It was a kind of grim satisfaction. Mercer said, "Good. That means Vorik is still there." Vorik did not panic. He calculated. In the Citadel Prime Command Annex, he stood in a private control room lined with clean glass and dark screens. The air smelled like polished metal and filtered ozone. Chief Counsel Mara Klein entered with a tablet already live. Her posture was confident, like she believed words could outrun consequences. Klein said, "Your legal declaration is public. Markets are stabilizing in our favor." Vorik did not look up. He kept his eyes on internal maps, because maps made people into objects. Vorik said, "For how long?" Klein hesitated, and the hesitation betrayed her. She had built a life on narratives, and narratives needed distribution. Klein said, "If they keep cutting our feeds, the narrative will not hold." Vorik tapped the control and brought up internal security maps. He spoke like a man who thought morality was a luxury item. Vorik said, "Then we do not let them hold anything." Chief Auditor Silas Van appeared next, face tight. He looked like a man who had watched a ledger turn into a weapon. Van said, "Earth stole a ledger pull. We have a breach in the transfer chain." Vorik's eyes stayed calm. He did not blame. He did not praise. He only ordered. Vorik said, "Then burn the chain." Van swallowed, and his throat moved like the last honest part of him. Van said, "If we purge the approvals, we lose continuity." Vorik said, "Continuity is a luxury. Survival is the contract now." Marrow broke into the room, and his breath was fast. He looked like a man reporting fire in a library. Marrow said, "Commodore Keth reports Earth has reached the inner lanes. They are moving fast." Vorik turned to a wall panel and placed his palm on a biometric pad. His voice did not rise, because control did not need volume. Vorik said, "Activate exit protocol." A hidden route lit up on the screen, a private corridor to a jump pod bay. It led to a corporate extraction ship that could vanish behind legal protections and false registrations. Klein stepped closer, and her voice tried to become persuasion. She still believed money could smooth anything. Klein said, "We can still negotiate. Offer concessions, offer a settlement, offer them money." Vorik's mouth tightened. For the first time, annoyance touched his face. Vorik said, "They're not here for money. They're here for a price." He looked at Vin and spoke the order like it was routine maintenance. His tone stayed calm, because he believed calm was control. Vorik said, "Start deletion." In the server core, lights switched from blue to amber. Automatic shredders began wiping command logs and contract approvals. Kovar technicians moved in teams, pulling drives and feeding them into sealed bins. Their hands moved fast, like speed could erase guilt. On the Valiant Dawn, Kara watched the system and felt the shift like a pressure drop. She spoke the warning without drama, because drama wasted seconds. Kara said, "They are purging. Mass deletion across Citadel Prime." Hart's voice stayed steady. She did not race anger. She raced clocks. Hart said, "We do not race their fleet. We race their erasers." Mercer turned to Reyes on a secure channel. He did not dress it up. Mercer said, "You and your team are the blade. You get inside and hold that data." Reyes did not ask why, because the why was written in a broken ring above Havenfall. Reyes said, "Understood." Hammerfall pods launched in pairs riding the edge of jamming fog. 2 pods took hits on approach, 1 aborted, and 1 kept going with hull scarred and guidance still true. Kara read the casualty line and forced herself to keep speaking. Speaking kept the room from drowning in silence. Kara said, 1 pod lost. 2 crews injured on launch. No further count yet. Hart did not soften. She did not allow the pain to become a reason to stop. Hart said, keep going. We are inside their clock. Citadel Prime met them with doors, not speeches. The first corridor was wide, bright, and empty, designed to make intruders feel exposed. The second corridor narrowed into a checkpoint built like a vault throat. Reyes led her squad forward with boots soft on deck plating. Behind her came a tech specialist carrying a capture pack. Ahead was a sealed door with a layered lock. A speaker played a calm synthetic warning that said, unauthorized entry, stand down. Reyes raised her weapon at the camera and kept her voice level. Reyes said, open the door, or we open it. Shots cracked from an upper gantry. Reyes and her team dropped behind bulkheads and returned controlled fire at positions, not bodies. Kovar defenders were trained and armored. They held the checkpoint the way a company protects its vault. A private behind Reyes breathed hard. His words came out clipped by fear and helmet air. The private said, they are boxed in tight. Reyes checked her squad. Her voice was hard, but it was also shelter. Reyes said, stay low. Stay together. We do not chase, we push. Mercer was not on a bridge now. He was in a boarding pod behind them with helmet sealed and breathing measured. He should have been on a bridge, but he chose proximity over comfort. He reached Reyes and tapped her shoulder. Mercer said, where's the lock? Reyes pointed to a recessed panel beyond the door. Her finger did not shake. Reyes said, pass that line. We need 10 seconds on it. Mercer nodded once. The nod was not encouragement, it was commitment. Mercer said, you give me 10 seconds. He moved into the open for 1 clean moment and threw a compact emitter across the corridor. It hit the deck and pulsed. Lights dimmed, sensors hiccuped, and gantry shooters lost their picture. Reyes surged forward with 2 squad mates. They reached the panel, cut the seam, peeled back the cover, and killed the lock in a brief spray of sparks. The door cracked open, and Kovar defenders fell back to a second line. They regrouped deeper to pull Earth into a corridor maze built to slow intruders by minutes. Mercer saw the trap and refused it. He pointed to a floor-level maintenance hatch. Mercer said, through there, not their hallway. Reyes nodded, and her team dropped into the hatch. They crawled through a narrow duct that smelled like coolant and dust. It was cramped and ugly, and it was faster. They emerged behind the second line, inside a server hall where racks stood like black trees. Kovar technicians were mid-purge. Their hands moved as if speed could erase the past. Reyes raised her voice once. She did not scream, because screaming was for panic. Reyes said, hands up. Most froze. 1 reached for panic switch. Mercer shot the switch housing, not the man. The buttons sparked and died. Mercer said, secure the room. We hold this hall. A Kovar team tried to retake the entrance. Reyes met them with controlled bursts and hard angles, and 2 Earth soldiers went down injured. Teammates dragged them back without ceremony. No screaming and no theater, just work. The tech specialist slammed the capture pack into a main trunk line. The pack started pulling everything it could, raw and ugly, before shredders could finish. Kara's voice came through Mercer's ear channel. It sounded like breath finally finding a path. Kara said, we are receiving. It is partial, but it is real. Mercer watched the transfer climb and felt time press against his ribs. He knew Vorik was moving toward his exit. Vorik reached the extraction corridor as the station shook with distant impacts. A security chief ran beside him with a face that looked like fear trying to become professionalism. The chief said, Earth teams are inside the core. They're taking the server hall. Vorik did not slow. He did not even glance back. Vorik said, then we leave. He stepped into a private lift and watched the doors close. The lift dropped through layers of station, past armored decks and sealed vaults. In the reflection of the door, Vorik looked almost bored. The lift opened into a hangar bay where a sleek corporate shuttle waited with engines warmed. Klein was already there, breath tight. She still believed in words as shields. Klein said, "They are close. We can still offer a settlement." Vorik walked past her and placed his palm on the shuttle hatch. The hatch unlocked with a sound like privilege obeying. A voice spoke behind him, calm and human. The voice did not ask, it did not threaten. Mercer said, "Director General Vorik." Vorik turned and saw Commander Evan Mercer step out of the shadows with Sergeant Reyes at his side. Both wore scorched armor and quiet eyes. Behind them were 3 soldiers and 1 Kovar clerk with wrists restrained. The clerk looked like a man who had learned the difference between policy and reality. Vorik did not flinch. His voice tried to become legal truth. Vorik said, "You boarded Citadel Prime. That is piracy." Mercer did not argue. He held up a small drive case like a mirror. Mercer said, "Your own ledger says otherwise." Vorik's gaze flicked to the case. His mouth tightened into something close to annoyance. Vorik said, "Evidence can disappear." Reyes said, "It already failed." Klein took 1 step forward, and her voice tried to buy the room. Klein said, "You want money, we can pay. You want access, we can grant it. You want protection contracts, we can rewrite the terms." Mercer shook his head once, and the simplicity landed like a slap. Mercer said, "You do not understand. We did not come for terms." Vorik lifted his chin like a man who believed he knew every human weakness. Vorik said, "Then you came for revenge." Mercer answered without heat, because heat was what Vorik wanted. Mercer said, "We came for accountability. You signed an order against trainees." Vorik's eyes narrowed, and his voice turned colder. Vorik said, "War has costs." Reyes stepped closer, and her words carried the weight of the dead without turning into spectacle. Reyes said, "Those were not troops in a battle line. They were students training to keep people alive." Vorik gestured toward the shuttle, and for the first time his calm sounded like impatience. Vorik said, "Step aside. You cannot hold me. Kovar will bury you in courts." Mercer looked at the shuttle, and the exit path Vorik thought was inevitable. Then Mercer nodded toward Reyes, and the nod was the only signal needed. Reyes moved like a switch being thrown. Her squad cut the shuttle power coupling, engines died with a quiet whine, and a side door sealed shut. Vorik finally showed irritation. It flashed across his face like a crack in glass. Vorik said, "You're making a mistake." Mercer raised his weapon, aimed low, and fired once. The shot shattered the floor near Vorik's feet and forced him back from the hatch. No blood and no spectacle, just control. Reyes and 2 soldiers closed the distance and took Vorik's arms. Vorik resisted for a moment, then realized resistance would not change geometry. He stopped. Klein opened her mouth to speak again. Mercer cut her off with a single sentence that sounded like a door closing. Mercer said, "Save your arguments. You will have a place to say them." Vorik looked at Mercer, searching for fear. He did not find it. Vorik said, "You think this makes you strong?" Mercer leaned in just enough for Vorik to hear him over alarms. His voice stayed quiet, and that quiet was the point. Mercer said, "It makes us responsible." They walked Vorik out of the hangar bay. Doors sealed behind them, and the shuttle sat dark and useless, a symbol of privilege that could not outrun consequence. Reyes tightened restraints on Vorik's wrists. She did not insult him, because insult was theater. Reyes said, "Move." Vorik took a breath, then another. The station shook again, and for the first time Vorik did not know if it was Kovar fire or Earth fire. For the first time, that difference mattered to him. The first attack after the capture was not a weapon. It was a document. Chief Counsel Mara Klein filed Kovar's emergency petition within hours. She claimed Earth committed piracy, stole proprietary data, and unlawfully detained Director General Kashin Vorik. Kovar allies echoed it across trade hubs. Cargo insurers began to freeze earthbound routes. On Terra Prime, Chairman Roland Pierce watched the economic map tighten one line at a time. Fuel premiums spiked, medical shipments slowed, and neutral stations posted polite notices that Earth vessels would be inspected and delayed. Counselor Miriam Ross stepped into the room with a thin tablet. Her voice was even, and the evenness was a kind of warning. Ross said, "They are trying to punish us without firing." Pierce nodded, and his eyes looked like a man watching a storm choose a coastline. Pierce said, "They think we will blink." Dr. Nathan Hale placed the case on the table. The sound was small, and the meaning was not. Hale said, "Then we do not blink." Admiral Celine Hart did not hold meetings for comfort. She held them for movement. Hart said, "We go to the Concord Tribunal. We bring a chain they cannot break." Commander Evan Mercer sat at the end of the table with uniform scuffed and eyes steady. Lieutenant Kara Vance stood behind him with hands clasped tight enough to hurt. Captain Jonas Reed appeared on a live feed from the Vigilant. He was still guarding the Havenfall lanes, because guarding was what remained. Ross looked at Mercer, and her question carried no softness. It carried the weight of watching the galaxy decide what was allowed. Ross said, "Are you ready to testify?" Mercer did not hesitate. His yes sounded like the last clean thing he owned. Mercer said yes, and I want Kara with me. Kara swallowed, and her throat felt dry. She did not hide, because hiding was what Kovar wanted. Kara said, "I can do it." Hart opened the evidence sequence like a drill. She made it mechanical, so nobody could pretend it was emotion. Hart said, "First, the sensor logs from Havenfall, then the ledger pulls, then the biometric seal, then the witness." Pierce asked the witness. Hart nodded once. Her eyes did not ask for belief, they demanded attention. Hart said, "The Kovar clerk we extracted. He will confirm internal approvals." On the Iron Crown, Commodore Keth watched Earth ships reposition into escort arcs. They were not moving toward battle. They were moving toward court transit lanes. It bothered him more than any threat broadcast. He spoke like a man confronting a mistake he could not price. Keth said, "They are not asking for permission." Marrow lowered his voice. He sounded like a man hearing markets shift. Marrow said, "They are building a case." Keth leaned forward. His lips tightened into something that tried to become confidence. Keth said, "Cases can be delayed. Cases can be buried." Marrow hesitated, then spoke the fear Kovar never admitted. Marrow said, "Unless the market is watching." Keth looked at orbital feeds and realized Earth had cut Kovar's story machine. Kovar could still speak, but they could not frame. A transport left the council complex under heavy escort. Inside was Vorik, restrained, silent, and surrounded by quiet professionals. No cameras were invited. No victory was announced. Hart watched the ship lift and kept her tone cold. Cold was safer than triumph. Hart said, "Let them spend their money on lawyers. We will spend ours on truth." Concord Station was built to look impartial. Its corridors were clean, its lighting soft, and its security visible without being aggressive. Every species that cared about commerce had a seat in its galleries. Commerce needed rules to survive. Vorik entered the chamber in a plain restraint jacket flanked by Concord guards. Klein walked beside him with posture confident, the look of someone who believed words could outrun consequences. Ross stood for Earth with Hart behind her as a quiet anchor. Mercer sat in the witness row with Kara, and Hale held a sealed evidence case on his lap. The presiding judge opened with a brief statement, then invited Kovar's argument. Klein spoke first, and her voice carried the practiced cadence of certainty. Klein said, "Earth raided Citadel Prime Station and kidnapped my client. This was an illegal act of aggression." Ross did not rise to debate. She touched her console and let proof speak where argument would be theater. Ross said, "Play the Havenfall sensor record." The chamber screens filled with space, black and calm. Then the sudden arrival of Kovar ships. Audio carried Kara's recorded voice calling out the blockade pattern as it formed. Klein tried to interrupt. The judge held up a hand, and the room obeyed the hand. Ross let the record run until targeting lines locked on Astergate Orbital Academy. The image did not linger on destruction. It lingered on intent. Vorik watched without expression. Klein shifted tactics like a blade changing angles. Klein said, "Even if that strike occurred, it was a lawful act of war." Earth refused compliance. Vorik lifted his chin like the courtroom was a boardroom. His voice stayed calm, as if calm could become truth. Vorik said, Kovar enforces stability. We neutralize threats. Ross turned a page and kept her voice level. Level voices change systems. Ross said, a training station is not a threat. Vorik shrugged, and the shrug looked like a profit calculation. Vorik said, collateral happens. Ross answered with sequence, not outrage. She displayed a ledger chain pulled from the transfer station, names, approvals, payment routes, and insurance riders that profited when fear rose. She paused on one line and looked at Vorik. The question landed like a pin in a map. Ross said, do you recognize this authority token? Vorik frowned. The frown was the first crack that mattered. Vorik said, it could be fabricated. Ross nodded to Hale. Hale stood and handed a biometric verification unit to the court officer. Hale spoke plainly, because plain words were harder to dodge. Hale said, this unit verifies the seal that authorized the strike package. It matches Director General Vorik's biometric key. Klein stepped forward, and the word came out fast like she could outrun math. Klein said, objection. Kovar uses delegated signatures. He cannot be tied to every field action. Ross gestured to the approval chain like she was pointing at a fingerprint. Her voice did not rise because it did not need to. Ross said, delegation is visible. This order was not delegated. The judge turned to Vorik. The question was simple, and simple questions ended games. The judge said, did you sign this authorization? Vorik smiled thinly, and the smile did not reach his eyes. Vorik said, I sign many authorizations. My staff prepares them. Ross turned to the witness bench. The restrained Kovar clerk stood under guard with eyes wide and breathing shallow. Ross said, were you employed in the contract approval office at Citadel Prime? The clerk said, yes. I processed the queue. Ross said, who required a direct seal for Academy targets? The clerk looked at Vorik, then away. His answer came out like a confession that would never fit back into his mouth. The clerk said, Director General Vorik. Only his key could clear it. A ripple moved through the gallery. It was not cheering, it was recognition. The galaxy was watching a war machine reveal its gears. It was watching a business model show its teeth. The verdict did not arrive like a dramatic hammer. It arrived like a door closing. The tribunal found Kovar Security combined liable for unlawful aggression and for targeting a protected training facility. It found Director General Kashin Vorik personally responsible for the authorization and for the coercive contract structure that enabled it. Klein argued for transfer, fines, exile, anything that preserved leverage. Vorik sat still as if still negotiating in his head. The judge read the sentence in a steady voice. Kashin Vorik would be imprisoned for life under Concord custody, with no corporate override, no private transfer, and no negotiated release. Kovar assets tied to coercive enforcement would be frozen pending independent audit. Allied stations would be subject to compliance review, and the contract template would be rewritten under new safeguards. Vorik finally spoke low and sharp, and the sound carried his first real anger. Vorik said, you think this makes you righteous? You think your rules will stop war? Ross walked to the center line and answered for clarity, not theater. Her voice did not pretend to be holy. Ross said, we are not claiming purity. We are claiming responsibility. She glanced once toward Mercer and Kara, then back to the bench. The glance was small, and it carried a planet. Ross said, we live by ethics because we choose to, but ethics are not a permit for you to do anything you want. She held the silence for one breath, and the breath sounded like a line being drawn. Then she spoke again, and the room listened. Ross said, you targeted our trainees. You treated the future like a bargaining chip, and the galaxy has seen what your business model requires. Vorik's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked like a man reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Vorik said, you could have executed me. You did not. Ross nodded once. The nod was not mercy, it was decision. Ross said, we could have. We chose law instead of spectacle. Hart did not smile. She watched the sentence land because she understood the difference. Killing a man ended a day. A verdict changed a system. Mercer stood as guards moved Vorik toward the exit. Vorik looked at Mercer as if searching for anger to feed on. Mercer gave him none. His voice was quiet enough that it belonged only to them. Mercer said, "You wanted us to sign. We signed something else." Vorik frowned, and the frown looked almost confused. Vorik said, "What?" Mercer said, "Your accountability." The doors closed behind the prisoner, and the chamber stayed quiet. Outside, trade feeds, updated, and insurance tables shifted as neutral stations recalculated risk. Earth did not celebrate. Earth exhaled. 6 months later, a new ring floated above Havenfall Colony. It was smaller than Astergate had been, but stronger. Its modules were layered, its evacuation paths redundant, and its shields designed to fail slowly instead of suddenly. It did not pretend tragedy could be prevented by pride. Hart stood in a simple viewing bay with Kara and Reed. Mercer was not there because duty did not pause for grief. Near the entrance, a plaque was mounted at eye level. The plaque carried 2 words in plain letters. Tomorrow still. No slogan and no corporate logo, just a promise chosen by the cadet families. The words looked small, and they felt heavy. Ross arrived and ran her fingers over the plaque, then pulled her hand away as if the metal was warm. Her voice carried the sound of building after fire. Ross said, "We build again." Kara stared out at the station frame. Her question came out soft, but the softness did not make it less sharp. Kara said, "And they will test us again?" Ross nodded. She did not lie to the young, because lies cost more later. Ross said yes, but now, the rules are different. Across the galaxy, neutral blocks proposed a new agreement. Training facilities would be protected under tribunal oversight, contract enforcement fleets would be audited, and insurance guilds would refuse to underwrite coercive blockades. Some stations accepted, some resisted, and some pretended they had always agreed. On Terra Prime, Dr. Hale walked into a secure room and placed a new file on the table in front of Hart. He did not speak at first, because the header said enough. Hart read it and felt her expression tighten. A different corporation, a different system, and the same contract language edited just enough to pass casual review. Hale looked at her. The question came out like a wound reopening. Hale said, "Do you see it?" Hart nodded. The nod was not surprise, it was confirmation. Hart said, "I do." Outside, tomorrow still rotated in quiet sunlight. Inside, the first new cadet class arrived with bags in hand and resolve in their eyes. They were 18 to 20, and they were not naive. They had grown up in a galaxy that finally believed Earth was not weak. Earth was restrained, and restraint, once proven, could become the most feared kind of strength. Tonight, the galaxy learned a lesson it will not forget. Earth did not answer brutality with cruelty. Earth answered it with discipline, evidence, and a verdict that could not be bought. Astergate was gone, but its purpose survived. Above Havenfall, tomorrow still turned in clean sunlight. It was built stronger and watched closer by people who knew exactly what restraint cost. Humanity was not gentle because it was weak. Humanity was gentle because it chose to be. But if you target our future, if you turn students into leverage, if you mistake our ethics for permission, then understand this. We will not beg, we will not kneel, and we will not let you hide behind contracts again. If you enjoyed this story and you want more hard science fiction where courage is quiet and consequences are real, hit like to support the channel. Share it with a friend who loves space war stories with heart. And subscribe because the next signal is already out there and Earth is already moving.